hours of humanities in the fall and 6 hours in the spring for all of our incoming Brock scholars, all of the incoming freshmen, first-year students who come here. So, and where are those guys? Raise your hands. Raise your hands. These are your future alum right there. It's a really amazing experience. It's 2 semesters, 6 hours each semester. It is literally 10% of the student's undergraduate degree, right? Because now your degree is capped at 120 hours. That's huge. And we are so happy to be that percentage for you. It's a class in which people read a lot and they write a lot and they argue a lot, but lovely in lovely tones. Is that a fair assessment of what humanities is? Yeah, okay. So last year, Dr. Gregory O'Dea decided to return to the English department and full-time teaching. And we also wanted to welcome our alum, because there's so many great alum here, all the alumni. Wave your hands. Anyway, glad you guys are all here, as well as people from the UTC community and the Chattanooga community. Last year, Dr. Gregory O'Dea decided to return to the English department and full-time teaching, leaving the work of honors administration that he had so dutifully and beautifully executed for 25 years. After I stopped crying, due to a swift and swiftly passing stroke of genius, I don't have them very often, I thought to ask him to consider teaching in honors as part of his new regular load in the English department. Thank you, Dr. Andrew McCarthy, for the support that you've always given us in the Honors College. Andrew is the department head in English, and we couldn't do it without the English department's support. And Andrew also taught humanities back in the day and kicked ass at it. Anyway, so I said, why don't you think about doing this? You can teach then one of the 5 sections of this Honors Humanities sequence, and in a moment of weakness, he agreed. That confluence, though, Greg leaving Honors Administration and joining again after many years the Honors Humanities classroom. He taught in Honors Humanities before he left the Honors Humanities classroom. It wasn't new to him. But that confluence led the way for the creation of this series. An annual event, the O'Dea Lecture in the Humanities, is intended to acknowledge the tremendous work done by Greg in honors education at UTC. The O'Dea Lecture focuses on the humanities, to ensure that we keep these concerns in the center of our university conversations. According to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the heart of the matter, it's a report that they did a while ago, the humanities are disciplines of memory and imagination, telling us where we have been and help us envision where we are going. There's nothing more important that you can learn in college, guys, than how to imagine something that is not your own personal experience. I firmly believe that, and that's what the humanities does. Getting verklempt, put it away, Linda. The humanities generally include the study of languages, literature, history, jurisprudence, philosophy, comparative religion, ethics, and the arts, and some other people who want to be really cool and get on board with us in the humanities. Few of us care about the tremendous possibilities, and I'm going to call it the current tragic popular dismissal of the humanities as a viable, vital intellectual practice, as much as Greg does. And I know because we've talked about this a lot. I am therefore very, very happy to welcome you here today to the first lecture in this new annual series, a series that we hope will be the catalyst for a transformative and powerful conversation every year. So, welcome to this talk delivered by Dr. Gregory O'Dea himself, entitled Humanities in the Wild, Reintroducing a Vital Species of Thought. Let's welcome Greg.
Happy Friday. Happy Friday. Thank you, Linda Frost, and to the Honors College for establishing this annual lecture. If you haven't figured it out yet, Linda's superpower is promoting and cheerleading other people. She works behind the scenes herself, doing so many amazing things of her own, not quietly, of course, always passionately, always fervently, but brilliantly, and with great intellect and good, thoughtful sense. So please help me thank Linda Frost and her marvelous Honors College for all they do. So I'm pointing here to Sharice Williams and Will Cubey and Leslie Pusey and Rebecca Caldwell, also to my colleagues in humanities instruction here, again, Jada Coons, Joseph Jordan, Devery Kimbrough, Alex Quinlan, we're all doing good work. And I hope that over time, this series is going to illuminate and open for discussion aspects of humanistic thought and activity. So terms like humbling and bewildering don't quite describe my feelings on being invited to inaugurate the lecture series. I'm not often humble. I'm often bewildered, that's true. But let me just say that right now I'm beyond grateful, so thank you all. To start it off, this now annual lecture series, to start it all off, and over the next few minutes, I want to attempt a few different things, however imperfectly. First, I want to try and define what I, for one, and perhaps we generally mean by our central term. To borrow a trope from the American writer Raymond Carver, I want to make clear what we talk about when we talk about humanities, and at least in the academic setting. Beyond the academy is a whole different ballpark, and so a whole different ball game, but we'll come to that certainly and quickly. Second, I want to present a brief overview of the various public discourses surrounding the humanities, and I want, especially in doing so, to focus on some recent recurrent claims and counterclaims, and their varying degrees of concern and contempt, dismissal and demagoguery, haranguing and hand-wringing, so that should be fun, right, to do. And let's see if this is working for me. Finally, I want to offer a metaphor, the metaphor of the zoo and the wild, that may be helpful in thinking about the current situation, or conception at least, of the humanities in public thought, and how that situation might be usefully repositioned. Indeed, I want to point to some really exciting and vital work already being done to that end right here in Chattanooga and UTC, and that's really my goal, is to shed a light on some of the great things going on at UTC in terms of the humanities and public engagement. So first of all, the humanities. As an attempted definition. The humanities is a very broad and flexible term. Generally, at least in an educational setting, it encompasses the study of a wide range of human thought and activity through academic disciplines like literature, history, philosophy, critical theory, languages, rhetoric, communication, art, theater, music, as well as aspects of the social sciences that we borrow from psychology and politics, geography, anthropology, and so forth. Fundamentally, those disciplines are concerned with questions of human being, ways of living in and making sense of the world, where, when, and however we experience it. So the humanities explore human creativity and knowledge, modes of thought, states of emotion, varieties of spirituality, dimensions of truth, ideas of justice, and more. And in practice, these studies involve intensive reading, committed debate and discussion, thorough research and writing and rewriting, and a wide array of different kinds of texts and artifacts. In terms of portable skill development, the humanities generally seek to deepen critical reading and thinking, and to shape and refine one's writing and other expressive practices through formal and informal research, investigations, analyses, reflections, and creative activity. So academically, that's what I talk about when I talk about the humanities, and more on that in a little bit. So the humanities narrative. The humanities narrative. I want to start, strangely, maybe with the GI Bill of 1944, or what is officially called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. This piece of legislation passed right toward the end of the Second World War essentially changed the landscape of higher education. It allowed for free or low-cost attendance to veterans who were returning from World War II. And in doing so, it really transformed college from what Milton Greenberg called predominantly rural, private, small, elitist, white and Protestant schools and programs, enclaves really, that were focused on the liberal arts, and transformed those institutions into much more heterogeneous sets of activity that sought to meet the more practical needs of an increasing number of veterans, students in their mid and late 20s, what we now call non-traditional students, students with families and a growing need for professional and vocational training and credentials. And so college as an experience, higher education as an experience, shifts from a kind of elite liberal arts idea to a much more comprehensive and indeed universal endeavor. So concurrently with that, and across the 1950s while all of that was happening, in 1959, very famously, the English novelist and physical chemist, he was both, C.P. Snow, identified what he called a growing rift in Western intellectual discourse. And he declared very famously that by 1959, we were essentially straddling two cultures. And he has a very famous essay on this point called The Two Cultures, of what he called the literary culture on the one hand and the scientific culture on the other hand. These two cultures, he said, seemed to speak different languages and espouse different values, and they were, if not mutually exclusive, they had become at least mutually incomprehensible to one another. And so here's a passage from his essay. He writes, "A good many times I've been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, were thought highly educated, and who have, with considerable gusto, been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice, I've been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics goes up, says Snow, and the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had." Snow went on in his essay, which really began as a lecture. Snow went on to criticize education in the United Kingdom for a century of overemphasizing the humanities, and particularly Greek and Latin studies, at the expense of science and engineering, which fields had actually decided the Second World War. Better to follow the lead of the United States, he said, which balanced these two cultures more evenly in educating its citizens. And so predictably, over the last 60 years or so, that supposed equilibrium in the United States of science, or what we now call STEM, and I think maybe the humanities needs to come up with a catchy acronym. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, right? What we now call STEM, that equilibrium between STEM and the humanities has become quite unbalanced, especially with the introduction of insurgent professional programs like business and things like that. And I'm kind of joking, kind of. Or at least that balance has become unbalanced in the minds of many who would undertake such studies, or those who would help fund them, state legislatures, for example, parents, perhaps. Because there is now a very clear cultural bias in education in favor of STEM and professional degree programs, and that bias is not simply neglectful of the humanities, it is quite actively and even violently agitating against degrees in the humanities and related social sciences. So, some examples, headlines, really, is what I'm projecting up here. "There is no case for the humanities," the headlines cry. The permanent crisis in the humanities, we're told. On and on. The humanities facing credibility crisis. To boost post-college prospects, cut humanities departments, and so forth. This bias is taking shape across quite a few different lines of argument, but they can be summed up in two broad categories. The first argument against the humanities, we're told, is economic, essentially. And the second is cultural. Economically, the arguments against the humanities are twofold. First, that humanities majors can't get jobs, or so the wisdom goes, and their degrees are therefore worthless. We've all heard some form of this frankly disgusting argument. For example, that a Bachelor of Arts degree should now be called barista artiste. And second, by extension, that university humanities departments are an unnecessary expense. Persuade people not to study the humanities, and the humanities will disappear. This is a baldly utilitarian argument, measuring value solely in terms of economic and even industrial efficiency, calibrated to somebody's bottom line. The humanities now apparently fail to meet what Laurie Fendrick has called contemporary demands for specific demonstrations of usefulness. I'll say that again. Contemporary demands for specific demonstrations of usefulness. At its core is the assumption that the purpose of education, this economic bias is what I'm talking about, at its core, the assumption is that the purpose of education is limited to creating skilled workers, and that the content of one's education should directly and obviously map onto a specific salary earning position, that one's major, in other words, must directly correlate to one's future job. So, engineering majors become engineers. Nursing majors become nurses. Accounting majors become, say it with me, accountants. And so on. The bias here is then in favor of the clear but limited career path. The counterpoint, here's more gloom and doom, I think. The humanities have no purpose. Mickey Mouse courses and so forth. The counterpoint to that argument is usually that the purpose of higher education is not simply or only to create compliant worker bees, but thoughtful, engaged, moral citizens, and that studying the humanities develops the kind of critical and creative thinking that build and sustain a viable and just society for everyone beyond the limited horizons of the 40-hour work week. Further, that there are many, many careers that require exactly the habits of mind fostered by humanities studies, but that aren't always clearly labeled for a particular major. Majors in English, or history, or philosophy, or communication often go on to careers and leadership positions in marketing and public relations, business, politics, law, management, and much more. The dean of our own Gary W. Rollins College of Business, after all, majored in philosophy as an undergraduate. The main idea here is that students who study humanities are prepared for many careers, not just one, and importantly, they're prepared for career changes, but those careers may not be as clearly labeled or as culturally visible. So, that's the economic argument and counterpoint in a nutshell. Culturally, the bias against the humanities is more complicated. It's also rooted in the utilitarian, that is, the idea that higher education is explicitly career training. But there are other aspects to this bias as well. U.S. culture has always had a strong anti-intellectual strain, and so notions such as the life of the mind or bodies of human thought sometimes seem elitist and even luxurious. But what really seems to upset some folks are things like critical thinking, cultural studies, critical theory, those lines of inquiry that might closely examine and interrogate traditional assumptions and practices. Nurses and engineers and accountants don't do that, or so the thinking goes anyway. But this is the paradox. On the one hand, we're told that studies in the humanities are worthless or useless or insular or out of touch or elitist. That is, that they are somehow enfeebled and impractical. But at the very same time, the humanities have long been the locus of and target for all sorts of cultural anxieties that have lately been derided by some with the term wokeism. Humanists, after all, are the ones spreading feminism, socialism, social justice, revisionist history, critical race theory, gender theory, anti-colonialism, deconstruction, you name it. We are the radicals behind the anti-American indoctrination factories threatening the status quo, or so the argument goes. And again, schools of nursing and engineering and accounting don't do that, or so they think. So which is it? Are the humanities weak and worthless, or are they powerful and dangerous? I say powerful and challenging, certainly. Dangerous depends on where you're sitting. But if you're on team weak and worthless, I wonder why you're so mad about it all. Why is so much energy being expended trying to make the case for gutting the humanities? Surely these worthless and weak modes of thought will just fade away, right? But I doubt it. I talked earlier about what I'm talking about when I talk about academic humanities in terms of disciplinary study. What humanities thinking offers to the greater good is much more important. As the name implies, the humanities draw on and foster human-centered understanding of experience and activity. It asserts over and over again that we are not robots, however much our corporate overlords might wish we were. These disciplines animate creativity. They encourage careful thinking about the complex and often paradoxical nature of human thought, emotion, and social relations. They teach us how to think about what's happened in the personal and collective past and why, and to understand contingent thinking, how to follow rational arguments as well as associative and irrational patterns, how to learn about unfamiliar cultures, values, and ideas, and how to consider the lived experience of other people. They teach us to formulate clear positions and articulate persuasive arguments. That's the humanist species of thinking, which many imagine abides only in the zoo. And so that's my metaphor. The zoo versus the wild. The zoo, in this case, is the university. You have to go there to see the species, and then you see them only in an artificial habitat. This is the view of humanities that imagines faculty and students just sitting around reading books and writing papers that nobody reads. Zoos are for containing and managing. They are not good for the species or for the natural world where the species rightly belongs. The wild, on the other hand, is, in this metaphor, the real world, right? Quote unquote, the real world, where species can survive and adapt and evolve, alter the habitat, and rebalance and revitalize that environment as necessary. This is the humanities work that engages the community. And so much of this work, vital work, is already happening in and around universities across the country, and certainly here at UTC and in Chattanooga. And it's been happening for a long time. So I want to highlight some examples of what is often called public humanities. Humanities in the wild, so to speak, engaging human thought and work and creativity in what is often called the real world. So what's especially exciting to think about is how much interdisciplinary work is going on in this work. Humanities scholars are collaborating with each other, yeah, but also importantly with scholars, professionals, and practitioners in a wide variety of fields. A large part of my own work over the last 25 years, for example, has been in the field of medical humanities, engaging healthcare professionals in humanist thought and work that helps them better understand their patients, how patient experiences, attitudes, cultures, backgrounds, hopes, fears might affect their health and their management of health care. I've done this largely through collaborations with the American College of Physicians as part of that organization's continuing medical education programs. And in this work, I've talked with hundreds of physicians, physician assistants, nurses, and other healthcare practitioners who come through my workshops and think about literature, film, history, philosophy, ethics, and more as a means of better understanding the people they serve. My message: when a healthcare professional walks into an exam room, she's not just reading a chart, she's encountering a whole human being, a person whose past experiences and associations and current frame of mind have everything to do with their health outlook. That's one example. On a related front, Julia Comiskey in UTC's history department has been working recently with public health faculty member Dawn Ford, psychology faculty member Kristen Black, and communication professor Jessica Freeman on research that will help us better understand the general public's experiences with and trust in public health guidelines during COVID, and how those experiences might affect behavior and messaging when the next public health crisis eventually and inevitably emerges. Turns out that public health policy decisions can benefit from a historical understanding of human behavior, how personal and communal memory function, and from that understanding, devising effective modes of communicating complex information. Professor Lucy Schultz in UTC's Department of Philosophy and Religion regularly engages students with community partners in her classes on environmental philosophy. In her course entitled Values and the Environment, Professor Schultz and her students collaborate with organizations like Grow Hope Farm and Hope for the Inner City, performing service learning work to build and support urban farms in traditionally underserved neighborhoods. It's work that relies heavily on learning about and understanding the experiences and needs of these communities, their histories, their identities, their attitudes toward food, farming, and self-sufficiency. As Schultz says, I want students to understand that philosophy is not just sitting back and reflecting on abstract ideas. It really does make a difference in the way we live in the world and how we relate to each other in the environment. Dr. Megan Hartline, my colleague in the English department, established a public humanities program at Trinity College in Connecticut, helping students there connect their academic work with vital, quote-unquote, real-world communities, humanities work. Since coming to UTC, she's pioneered a number of community-based class projects, setting students to work on complex and meaningful problems, such as working with organizations on immigrant rights, where students compile research on rent and food assistance opportunities for undocumented residents in the area, as well as creating promotional and informative materials like videos and infographics for multiple marginalized communities. Like Lucy Schultz, Dr. Hartline has also worked with food access and urban farming, connecting students with City Farm Growers Coalition to create videos and brochures to help the organization raise funds for several of their ongoing projects, including an urban farm at Howard School. Dr. Hartline's Writing for Social Change class recently learned directly about food access in Chattanooga by working in the gardens over the course of a semester and creating a communications product, a blog post, series of social media posts, and so on for the organization. And her current research is focused on the barriers people face as they learn about community change-making processes, ranging from universities and high schools to state legislatures and community organizations. Professor Will Davis is doing outstanding work both in the communication department and in the Honors College, using UTC's Pod Lab right up there to teach students storytelling with podcasts, and in the process bringing to public light powerful stories that might otherwise be forgotten or neglected, such as the terrible history of Ed Johnson's lynching on Chattanooga's Walnut Street Bridge in 1906 and current contemporary response. We're collaborating with StoryCorps and other community organizations throughout the Tennessee Valley on the One Small Step project, where we are all invited to meet a fellow resident with different views than ours, who we might never talk to otherwise, for a simple, personal 50-minute conversation. The University of Tennessee at Chattanooga is one of just 6 sites selected nationally to host One Small Step in this current year. And the conversations it's fostered will be preserved for future generations in the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. So these are just a few examples of ways that the humanities are actively engaged in creating positive change in our community, and of the kinds of skills, experience, and values that students learn in studying the humanities, whether it's in a single class or an entire major. I haven't even begun to touch on the many, many other activities of our faculty and students who guide enriching activities for our schools and community organizations like the Urban League, or the faculty and students who provide and make the most of scores of internship opportunities, or the many humanities community outreach programs like the English Department's interdisciplinary Take 5 lecture series, the History Department's Historians React to Current Events series, and more, all with the aim to help the broader Chattanooga community to make sense of the complex world in which we live. In any professional, here's some fun slides. In any professional or business setting, these activities would be hailed and praised as innovation, as positive disruption, as necessary evolutionary steps forward that both critique and re-engineer traditional ways of doing things. As practiced in the humanities, such work is too often derided from the outside as both weak and woke, as somehow simultaneously irrelevant and dangerously radical, precisely because they question the status quo. And I think we need to take a very hard look at how we define both the zoo and the wild. And I would argue that if the academy or the university isn't the real world, neither is industry or corporate culture. The real world is where human beings live and struggle and think and work and lead their complex, varied lives. The real world is where we try and help everyone to something better. You aren't your majors. I'm talking to the students now. You're not your majors. You're not your offices. You're not your titles. You won't be your paychecks. You're not your job. Please understand that. You're never just your job, or a cog in an engine, and you're never just a wage slave. You're a human being. And so, before you get to all those other things, maybe start with that. Start with being human. Thank you.
We'll do some questions if anyone has questions for Greg. I've just like got things in my throat for Greg right now. So.
Oh boy. Any thoughts? Yeah. The role of science in undergraduate education is the question. It should and ought to have a really, really prominent role. My sense is that where we've gotten off track is somehow detaching the idea of scientific inquiry from other kinds of inquiry. If you go down to the chemistry department, or if you go over to the biology department, or to the Sim Center, or to the College of Engineering, most of the faculty members you will encounter there have PhDs, right? They are doctors of philosophy. It's just that they are asking philosophical questions about different problems than the humanities are. Right? So the sciences, yes, absolutely ought to be very central to a university education. That's where other kinds of innovation take place. Not always social innovation, sometimes that's a byproduct, but other kinds of innovation that make our lives better, easier, we hope, or that solve other kinds of problems. But my feeling is that it's all philosophy, my friends. It's all philosophy. It's all about trying to figure out how to make the world better and advance our position in it. We're just looking at different kinds of problems. And maybe we're doing it in slightly different ways. Maybe there's a lot of overlap in the way in which we conduct those inquiries. But we're all doing the same thing. We're just working on different problems, as we should, because there are a lot of problems out there. Thanks for the question, David. Another David. Yeah. Thank you, David, for the question. I think a lot of this is artificial posturing, to be honest. I mean, I think most of the most vocal people who call for things like national divorce, who want to tell me what I can teach and not teach in my classroom without having any understanding of what I'm doing or what I'm trying to accomplish. I think a lot of times most of those people don't really care one way or the other. What they're doing is stoking a kind of divisiveness that they know will somehow keep them in power, if I'm honest. I don't think they really care, and I don't think most people get mad about the things I was talking about until they're told to be mad about them. Not that they were ignorant that I'm teaching certain kinds of books in a classroom, but they don't know that they're supposed to be mad about it until somebody tells them that they should be mad about it. So I would beware of the loudest voices in public discourses. Listen to the quiet people, Listen to the quiet people. Listen to the introverts. They've thought about it more, right? They've listened more and talked less. Joel.
Back to something you ended on in the first question. So we're all trying to solve different problems, but then could the humanities bring more thought into the impact of those solutions? So I was thinking if you have the science department and everyone has kind of a textbook case of something horrible they did where they didn't see the side effects
Yeah.
of what they were doing. It seems like the humanities could bring a big role in the impact of things before we do something like, there's other two things.
Yeah. It's what I call the Frankenstein problem, right? Just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should do it. Right? Just because you have the ability doesn't mean you have the right or the moral ground on which to act. So yeah, I mean, I think humanities can bring that kind of perspective. But I also think that science and technology, if they are going to be central and should be central to a university education, need to be thought of as human activities. The things we study as scientists aren't always human beings. geologists study what they study, astrophysicists study what they study. But they do it, I think, because it brings value back to the human being. Right? We want to know about the geological formations of certain areas, even if only to know whether that's a good place to build something or not, or what sort of natural resources we might be able to use. Science and technology, STEM, I suppose all of it, is kind of pointless if it's not in some ways human-centered, right? So I'm thinking about things like human-centered design. How do you make, a cell phone that is most useful to human beings? Because, it's people that are going to end up using these things. They don't just sit there having value by themselves. If science and technology can keep in mind that the human being is in some ways both the origin and the goal, the person doing the studies and the end user, so to speak, I think that a lot of those problems might get solved. And humanities can maybe help people do that. What's science and technology for? It's for us. It's for us. And so we need to figure that part out for sure. Yeah.
I'm an accounting major. You mentioned accounting majors.
Yeah. Good for you.
Yeah, right. I am for now. But, I find that students can be very limited in what they take because of financial limitations, maybe time limitations because they have jobs and things along those lines. So students in my position who aren't in the honors college but are in majors like accounting, they might not have as many opportunities to take classes that have humanities-centered values. So how do you suppose that we infuse these sorts of values in these subjects that don't otherwise have what you think are valuable, or what are valuable to the world, to people?
What a great question. Because you're right, and there was a lot going on in that question too. So let me back it up, and I might ask you to give me a signpost or two to help me through it. The first bit about how in a 21st century university setting, yes, economics comes into it, finances come into it, increasingly so. Right? Increasingly, those entities that fund your education beyond the tuition you pay, in other words, the state or federal portion of your education is becoming more and more limited, right? They're giving less and less money. Former chancellor of this university liked to say that, one time we had state universities, then we had state-supported universities, and now we have state-located universities. Right? So less and less of the pie is coming from sources other than the tuition that you pay. And there are a lot of policies afoot to make that situation even worse. Limiting what courses you can afford to take. Again, sort of the worker bee mentality, the job training mentality. So your question is really great because you say, well, if that's the case, then how do we get this really vital kind of thinking into the courses that we do take and that we can afford to take? And I would go back to a version, I think, of what I said to Joel just a moment ago, which is that if we undertake to understand things, areas like accounting, as human-centered activities, I know that might seem difficult to you right now, but it is, because what you're doing is you're working, I don't know what you're doing, you're working with spreadsheets. I mean, in my day it was ledger sheets, I don't know, right, stuff. But pretty soon you're going to be working with people, right? And these are people who have hopes and desires and needs, both imagined and future-oriented and current and present. And as an accountant, if you can keep in mind that what you're doing is helping people and trying to understand their situation and how you can help in terms of helping them better understand their own financial situation, you're doing the Lord's work, I would say. But you need always, no matter what you're studying, you need to think that this is being done for human beings. There are always people behind whatever you're doing and human reasons for what you're doing. Otherwise, human beings wouldn't do it, right? Human beings only do what human beings do. We're like pretty much every other animal that way, right? Ants do what ants do. Human beings do what human beings do. And a lot of what human beings do is create structures and societies that sustain that species, that make life better, that make life what we can imagine it to be. So none of you is studying anything that doesn't have to do with human beings. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. So you were a creative writer, Terry, as an undergraduate. Yes. Yeah. No, I get you. I get you. So the first thing I would say is that it was not my intention here in any way to argue against STEM at all, but instead to argue in favor of the humanities, which is as you can see from the headlines, again, being kind of actively and violently militated against. And I don't think anybody's against science and technology or the investments they bring to us, because they improve our lives. They should. They do. Right. Yeah. No, I get you. I get you. And we're grateful for that, I'm sure. But
So I'm going to go back for a minute, and I'm not going to go off on a drag about this, I promise, Greg. But just two things I want to say quickly to you. One is, as a friend of mine said, she feels strongly that all students have the right to study in humanities. And I'm just putting it in those terms, because as you know, as I as well know, as we pointed out, the financial realities of how you're able to pay courses is something that we need to explore in more detail. Right? That's terrible. It's beyond terrible. And I want to just point out, and I'm looking at my phone while you're talking, because I asked my colleague Tony, it was kind of through press. There was an article a few days ago about our business building, which is not yet funded, right? And two of our legislators and two of our local, right, UTC contingent pointed out that UTC's job is to provide employees for a company or whatever. Our job is to provide employees. That's it. And when I heard that like boldly, stated in the newspaper, in a sort of uncontested, seemingly unproblematic way, I get physically ill. Because that's not why I'm here, working with y'all. I don't get jobs, and I really will, because you want to do that. You want to have a life, right? But the humanities are a thing that we have to have the right to study. The right to do that. And it's true, in order to preserve it, and I will do everything I can to make sure that that stays the same. It's becoming increasingly difficult to preserve the kind of things that you guys do for our humanities classes. Increasingly difficult. Sorry, that was just a comment. But when I read that in the paper, I thought, oh my God, I don't know what she needs to know. So I want you to know that that's how I feel about your education. And I want you to trust.
hey, Chris. I agree with some of it, but to the extent really that I think a lot of academic fields tend to be, or can tend toward the frivolous. So let me put it this way. I think that your example about a change in the discourse when we talk about history singular versus histories plural. I think what we're trying to do, what scholars who make that move are trying to do, is to recognize the real variety and complexity that have too long been put under the same umbrella, bushel, whatever. And I do think that while in the popular imagination, STEM fields do have a right and a wrong, right? 2 + 2 does equal 4. What they don't often consider, I'm going back to Joel Sherrill's question about the should and the ought, the Frankenstein problem I mentioned. I think science and technology fields often deny the complexity of not what they're doing, but why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and for whom they're doing it. Science is hard. Engineering is hard. And there are right and wrong answers in the methods. What, at least in the popular imagination, people seem less aware of is the complexity in the application of those things. Why are we doing what we're doing in science and technology? Should we be doing what we're doing? So even there's a lot of variety and complexity that needs to be acknowledged in the way I think a lot of humanities disciplines have said, you know what, there isn't just one history. There isn't just one human experience. There isn't just one cultural center. And why do we want so badly for there to be one? Why do we want everything to be more homogeneous than heterogeneous? It doesn't matter what you want, it isn't. Right? So let's acknowledge that and study that and think about it.
Yeah, I would agree with you, but on some level, though, because such things as truth and truth is the natural norm of not real people, and you can use
Well,
our and take a look at it and see that's fact. And I think that sometimes with our emphasis on cultural relativism and humanity, as I said, undercut ourselves.
alternative facts is a strange phrase.
So in some ways, this was a performative act of contemporary demonstration of research. And this is a genre, right?
Yeah.
Is your discipline, within your discipline, your value, is this happening for particle physicists, like general scientists that are doing basic research, right? You don't want to fund basic research, you want the stuff that gives you gas. So I wonder, there's a tendency that here, and I think the two different sides could often flesh off the science for the big group often present. People are talking about the history of human curiosity and the story of science. Children are born with science asking questions about the world. Philosophers say the same thing, the history of human knowledge and philosophy. Children are born with philosophy. So in that sort of paradigm, in this sort of genre of thought, is someone co-opting something? And what can they both be right in some way, and how can this be true? And what type of say more specifically alliances between scientists doing basic research that might be abstract and philosophical in concept with humanities like poetry or thinking of abstract stuff. I'm a scientist, and all these things, it's not even that
You're right. The kind of narrative we're worrying about here really is a genre of its own. I mean, the kinds of statements we're making. At bottom, though, Taylor, what I would say, I'm fond of saying often, well, human beings are storytelling animals. Well, that's me, right? Because I'm an English person and we tell stories. Philosophy person might say we're all natural-born philosophers. I think what we are maybe most basically, is a species that asks questions. We wonder about things. We get curious, whether those things are, whether the questions we ask will lead to answers or conclusions that are practically useful or not is really beside the point, because you can't stop human beings from wondering about things and asking questions and trying to find the answers. The real question is, are you going to fund the asking of those questions, right? And so I would simply go back to the point that Linda made a moment ago. We have the right to wonder. We have the right to ask the questions and to do it in a formal and regular way, such as the university can provide. To say that there are some questions that cannot be asked, that should not be asked, I think is a disgusting position to take.
I just want to thank Greg again and all of you for coming out. This is wonderful. Please look for next year's O'Dea lecture in the humanities, determined by our humanities faculty. We will have those conversations. I'm excited about it. Again, thanks so much. Please take food. And of course, Greg is here and able to talk until he has to go to his next appointment. Thank you again.